we're going to go ahead and start with our actual presentation. I didn't give you much warning there, did I? But our speaker today is Dr. Loren G. Davis from Oregon State University. Dr. Loren Davis has been with OSU Department of Anthropology since 2008, most recently taking on the role of Professor of Anthropology in 2017. Along with teaching, Dr. Davis is the director of several research programs throughout Oregon and California. Today, he will be presenting how new discoveries at Cooper's Ferry increase our knowledge of early Pacific Northwest peoples. So everybody go ahead and welcome Dr. Davis. Start of the show.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to OAS. And hello to everybody who's here virtually. This evening, we're going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing for a long time at a site in Western Idaho known as the Cooper's Ferry site. And this site has been known in the archaeological literature since at least the 60s when it was first investigated. And this is sort of the story that you might hear when you hear people talking about archaeological sites, is that often they get revisited and they get revisited over time. And this is a similar kind of story that way. But the work that we've done there has really revealed a lot of archaeological evidence about the timing of when people were in our region, and then also gives us some really unique perspectives on what they were doing when they were at the site. And in turn, that shows us a lot of details about the lifeway that people in the interior part of the Northwest were pursuing in the past. This site's also an important place because it's the location of where oral history among the Nez Perce Indians refers to this place as Napaha, which is a village that has been in oral history for a very long time, but it goes along with a story too about two children showing up and being sort of taken in at a village at this place in the canyon. And we'll talk a little bit about the concept of village. How do you measure a village? What does a village look like archaeologically? We'll talk a little bit about that stuff. And we'll also talk a lot about the details of how is it that we really establish the ages of things. Because you hear claims a lot talked about in the media. You know, people will have news stories about, oh, a new discovery is made here and there. But that's the easy part. Actually talking to the media is the easiest part of all. I could just pick up the phone and make a claim and do things like that. What we're going to talk about tonight is sort of the background, the nuts and bolts of how you actually have to go through the process of nailing things down. And it's really quite difficult to do it, especially if you're going to make a claim that someone is living in Western Idaho close to 16,000 years ago. So that's a big deal. And we'll talk about how we know this. And also, too, we'll talk about what does this mean? If people are in Western Idaho at this time, what does that tell us about the bigger picture? Are there coordinating aspects that we can talk about? You know, are there links to other parts of North America? And we'll sort of get to that because that picture is just now beginning to emerge. And Cooper's Ferry has a lot to say potentially about that aspect. So I did things out of order. So this was my title screen, but you already get the idea. This is a shot of the Salmon River Canyon. You can see it's sort of bring your own tree kind of environment. It's a really hot place. When I took this photograph a long time ago, it was probably close to 115 degrees or so. And it gets really, really warm there. It's a kind of place where 100 degrees feels reasonable. You know, you've been there living there for 6-8 weeks, you know, and it doesn't get below 100 degrees till 3 in the morning or something. So it's a really hot place to work. But from an archaeology point of view, it has been a place that has revealed a lot about the past, and I've always enjoyed working there. Okay, so let's move on. Here's the rules. These are archaeology rules, I guess we could call them. How do we figure out when something is actually what we say it is in terms of age? So in order to establish a claim for really any antiquity in the past, but especially things that are very old, you obviously have to have objects of clear human origin. And I'm sure people know this, but it's always good to review. Now you have to answer the question, are these artifacts? Does these actually show us that people were here? Or are they something else? Are they made by nature? or people maybe need to get their eyes checked or something, you know. We get a lot of this sometimes, but we also, second part, you have to figure out the age, and we say chronometric age determination. That is, you have to work with a laboratory to figure out the actual timing of when something happened. Because if you're going to say it was, in our case, 16,000 years ago, you better have some really, really strong science that backs this up. So it's a good theme, I guess. Here we're at OMSI talking about science. We work very closely with laboratories, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Third part, you have to show that the thing you're dating actually goes along with the thing that you're saying represents people. So it's not enough to have an age. The age also has to be trustworthy and has to be good, and has to go along with the object. And the last one, I'm not sure if it's covered up, but I'll just basically read it. You have to demonstrate consistent environmental context. That is, if you're saying it's 16,000 years old, the environment should probably look like a glacial environment. That is, all the other indicators around you that you can measure, the sediments, if you can measure plants like pollen and things like that, that should be consistent. Okay, I don't mean to be too pedantic, but fall term's almost here. So we're getting ready to get back to school, and it's always good to review. Okay, so this is what the Northwest looked like around 16,000 years ago, we think. And so I just basically went through the literature and found a lot of evidence about maps that people had made most recently and even into the past, but things were based on good evidence that showed us the position of two big ice sheets, the Cordilleran ice sheet and the Laurentide ice sheet. Cordilleran is anchored on the Rocky Mountains. The Laurentide ice sheet comes out of Hudson Bay and flows in all directions away from it, but toward the Rockies. Cooper's Ferry is sort of nestled in this cul-de-sac of glacial ice. There's big ice sheets to the north, but there's also a lot of ice in Idaho. There's actually a lot of mountain glacier complexes. If you've ever been out to the Wallowas, you go out to Enterprise and places like this, or Joseph even, there's lots of evidence of a glacial terrain there, and you can see the glacial ice that we have in that spot. So ice was not that uncommon. And as you see, these blue polygons are areas where the ice started to interfere with the hydrology of our region. It began to dam rivers and cause big impounded lakes that sometimes would break free and push incredible amounts of water, which I'm sure everyone in the room knows about this, the Missoula floods, for example. This is just a map showing the distribution of the Missoula floods and where they went. So, you know, we would be underwater here, you know, if we were giving this talk and when the Missoula floods were going. And finally, to the west, to make ice the size of Canada, which is what happened at 16,000 years, the water budget comes out of the world's oceans. And so you get lower sea level than you do today. And so here, the tan polygon shows us a map of what Washington and Oregon's coastlines probably look like. And so west of Newport to Florence, we had about 35 extra miles of coastline. So a really big, different environment, really quite amazingly not like today. It also was a place where there's a whole menagerie of megafauna running around that are now extinct, but you know, mastodons and mammoths and camels and horses and things like this. So that was all part of this world that these people around 16,000 years ago would have been living in. Okay, back to the Cooper's Ferry site in the Lower Salmon River Canyon in western Idaho. If you're not aware, the Lower Salmon River Canyon is the second deepest canyon in North America. Grand Canyon's number 3, and Hell's Canyon's number 1. And that's not advertised very well. They got to make a bigger deal about this. But basically, it's the wall of the canyon that has the Seven Devils Mountains. Is over 10,000 feet at the top and below 3,500 feet below. So it's it is the deepest canyon if measured from that point. Now it's not comparable exactly to the Grand Canyon in other beautiful ways, but it's a big, deep place. In fact, the tops of the canyon that you see in this photograph are not the very top. They're just a set of ridges, and then it keeps on going into the distance. But here we can see the Cooper's Ferry site's positioned at where the star is, and it's on the tributary of a major side canyon and the main canyon where the Salmon River is running below us. And that's a significant thing too, because these major side canyons are distributed about once every 20 miles, and they're controlled by fault systems in this part of the world. So they're not just naturally everywhere, that is, they're not commonly everywhere. They're controlled by what the geology is doing. And then also too, there's a big gravel bench we see below us in front of the Cooper's Ferry site. And some of my colleagues at the Nez Perce tribe say places like this are good to camp at because the driftwood gets delivered to you as a firewood gets brought to you. So, people don't really want to climb up and cut cordwood and bring it down. That isn't probably what they were doing in the past. So that would have been a very important place. Plus, it would have given you a really excellent way to get out of the canyon and access to other ecosystems up that side canyon that you would be easier to get to. So that's probably why the Cooper's Ferry site is positioned here. In 1997, I worked at the Cooper's Ferry site for the first time. I was a graduate student at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. And we dug a 2 meter by 2 meter pit. And this photograph shows us what we were seeing in the north wall of the pit. And you can see it's a layered sequence of deposits. There's sand on the top. It gets a little bit more silty and brown below. And then toward the part where the text box is, it gets into a tan color. And that tan color is where the earliest deposits and archaeological evidence is contained. And that material is wind-blown glacial dust, or loess, as it's often called. And this was our only perspective when we got started, because the archaeologists had worked there in the 60s. B. Robert Butler had dug some trenches with the backhoe, and then they sifted the backhoe material, pretty coarse technique for figuring out things. But they did get to see that there were artifacts buried very deeply, but what they couldn't do is figure out the age of things. Radiocarbon dating hadn't progressed as a scientific method that would allow you to date very small pieces of organic material, which was what we really find here. We don't find a lot of big pieces of charcoal or bone, for example. So in the 1970s and beyond, there were major advances in radiocarbon technology that allowed us to measure extremely small pieces of carbon. So now you can measure a piece of charcoal that's a little less than a grain of rice in size, whereas you really couldn't do that before. You needed about a baseball or so to date. Anyway, the point is, there's a lot of things we didn't know about the site, and my work in there in 1997 was designed to try to address some of the questions that were unanswered. And I worked with the Bureau of Land Management very closely. This is BLM managed land. And my colleague, David Sisson at the Bureau of Land Management, began conversations very early on when he and I began to become interested to learn more about the site. He began to have conversations with the cultural program peoples at the Nez Perce tribe, which then led to presentations and discussions with tribal council at Nez Perce tribe, which then led to a letter of support. And the Nez Perce tribal council wrote a letter of support that basically stated that they were interested in the work that we would do here, and they think that the results of our work, our research, could be beneficial to the tribe. And they were curious to know what things might be held here and how it could relate to them understanding, this sort of concept of time immemorial, the time before memory, this really deep perspective on their heritage and culture. So in 1997, we dug that 2 meter by 2 meter square, got down to the very bottom. And of course, in the very last day of our project, we began to run into these gravel deposits. You can, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see these squares, and they say A, B, C, D, and so on. That square shows us one of our units is going down into loess, this wind-blown glacial dust. And as you can see, there's some rocks poking out of that stuff. Well, that doesn't make sense geologically. We fortunately don't live on a planet where baseball size and larger rocks fly around the air all the time. So I knew already that something else was going on. There was more than one reason why these rocks were showing up, and it could be natural, but I thought it also could be cultural. And as we dug downward, and each of these photographs shows a 10-centimeter depth interval at the end of every level. And the upper three show us a pile of rocks that basically were assembled at the top of, if you go down, a circle. In the circle, you can see darker sediment that as we get to the basal deposit, which is gravel, there was no gravel there. It was mostly sand and a little bit of some rocks. And then it kept going and going. So essentially what we found was something that was a little bit smaller than a trash can in shape and volume, excavated into the ground. And these artifacts that we see on the right were contained inside that pit. And so this, I think, is a pit feature. It's a purposefully excavated pit. It got filled back in with sediment, and then people put the contents of essentially someone's toolbox in the ground, and then added sediment back in and put a pile of rocks on top. Now, there was a little bit of bone and other pieces like chips of debitage from flaking stone tools also in the pit, but the bone was so small and fragmentary we couldn't identify what animals they were. But my best guess is they were probably medium-sized animals, so in the range of elk or very small elk to deer-sized animals. Elk are really more large. But what's important about this, at the very top of the row of artifacts, you see these 4 stemmed projectile points, and that's what we call these stemmed projectile points. They have a little tab at the bottom, and that's the stem part. They're not notched, they're not fluted, they're stemmed. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, the reason why this is sort of a big deal as a concept is that what you're seeing here is the end result of someone having ideas and putting these ideas in motion. And they're saying, I can find a rock in the environment. I can take this rock apart according to probably things I've learned. And maybe I had some new ideas for myself, but more likely I'm copying knowledge that was taught to me. I'm taking the rock apart in a way that is trying to achieve a certain kind of design. And this design likely makes sense in the context of the other technology that was being used to propel these things. We think they are projectile points. And so you would put them at the end of probably an atlatl dart. I heard mention of throwing an atlatl in the announcements part, so everyone probably understands what that is. But if you don't, it's an arrow that's longer than an arrow. It's as tall as you are, and you would throw it with a stick with a little hook on the end. So it would be a way to propel a smaller gauge spear. And if you put one of these small points at the end, even if they're not large, with that kind of weapon system, they could be very deadly, even to large animals. Below this, we see some scraping and cutting tools, and below it, we found a hammerstone, a core, and some other scraping tools. So again, this is a toolkit that was probably designed to achieve a whole lot of different things. People could make all kinds of different objects just with these things if you were skilled. And we found them together. We found them together in a pit, and archaeologically, this also suggests that we're probably finding a snapshot in time of someone's activities, the things that they knew, and how they could put them all together. Now, it almost never happens that we get to see parts of the past in such fine detail, that we can actually talk about a moment in time. That almost never happens. You might find things in a layer. You find a lot of objects in a layer, but that layer could have taken 100 to 1,000 years to accumulate. And how do you know what things really went with exactly one time or another? It can be difficult to know. But this actually gives us high resolution understanding of the past. Okay, well, after doing this work, I was actually a student at the University of Alberta still, and I wrote a paper with my major professor, Charlie Schwager. And in this, we made the statement in the end, which is that based on the presence of key radiocarbon ages and distinctive stratigraphic criteria, essentially we said that people made this pit feature at a time between 11,400 to 11,370 radiocarbon years ago. Now, to translate that to calendar time, which is mostly what we'll talk about here, that's about 13,000 calendar years ago. So that's a time period, especially in the year we wrote this. This was 2004. That's during a time period when the concept that stemmed points could be 13,000 years old was heresy. It was ridiculous. Like, I actually had people tell me at conferences, like more elder archaeologists say, you shouldn't work on this concept of the stem point stuff being very early because you'll be laughed at as a kook. You'll never get a job. And I thought, well, we're just doing science. We'll just see what happens. Like, I don't want to prejudge it. I don't want to lose my nerve. And I'm glad I didn't. But because I would, as you probably have heard in other presentations, I mean, things have changed a lot since 2004. So this is where we were in 1997. We basically said there's a really long record of occupation here, and it starts very, very early, we think. And all we knew is from that 2 meter by 2 meter hole. Okay, later on, I got a job at Oregon State University, and we worked out another plan to start to do more excavation here at the site to learn more. Because what we saw in 1997 was very tantalizing. We wanted to know more detail. Because even though I thought we did a pretty good job presenting our case about people being here very early, you know, the critics will often say, well, if it's true, you got to do it again. Like, prove it again, or prove it again. You know, all right, 2 is not enough. You got to, let's see it 3 times or more. So that's fine. And truly, if it is a thing that the people were here at the site 13,000 years ago, we should be able to demonstrate that again if we were to excavate in another part of the site. So we, working with the Nez Perce tribe and with the Bureau of Land Management, we went forward to excavate more at the site. And we opened up 2 areas. So we call them areas, and essentially they're large blocks of many 1 by 1 meter squares put together. And the reason we wanted to excavate a big area, they're sort of like 2 small swimming pools that we dug here. We wanted to dig in that scale, one, because it's somewhat deep. And as we get deeper, we have to step the walls in, or else the wall could collapse on you, and that would be bad. But also we wanted to have a big unit so that we could understand what people were doing here at the scale of human life. Meaning, if we went to your house 10,000 years from now and excavated a 1 meter by 1 meter square into your house, what are the odds that we could understand your life very well? Not so great. That's not a great window. But if we excavated something like 12 meters by 12 meters, that's a big area. And that's what Area B ended up being at the end, 12 by 12. So we had a much better chance of understanding things about what people were doing there. We also had a big task ahead of us, and that was to not only excavate these big areas, and Area B, by the way, was where B. Robert Butler, this other archaeologist who worked there in the 60s, that's where he had worked. So we wanted to see more of what he was reporting that we didn't really understand. But we not only were going to open these things up, but we're going to do it in a way where we're going to attempt to map everything the size of a dime and bigger in the ground. We're going to want to find it in the ground and map it in place. And I'll show you why that's important later, because that ends up being this sort of ridiculously large, complex data sets that reveal a lot about what's happening likely at the site. Now, of course, as you all know, we can't understand it as a sort of time machine perspective. You can't go excavate a site and expect to see it exactly as it happened in the past. You're seeing some very, very small, what gets preserved record of the past. So we're going to do our best by recording as much data as we can. That was sort of the strategy. And that's why it also took us 10 years. We worked 10 summers in a row to work on this. Okay. We did this work with students at Oregon State University. So we ran Oregon State University archaeology field schools for 10 years at this site. And I really could not have done this project and talked about this today without their help, of course. You know, somebody has to be sort of in charge making decisions about what to do, but the majority of the actual excavation happens by these students and by people that help us. So fortunately, we had really great students to work with through the years, and we could not have done it without them. So let's get down to what it is that we were finding as we opened up much larger areas. So this is a familiar scene again. The orange arrow is pointing to this boundary between, let's call it layer 7 and layer 6. And that line between them represents an ancient surface. So that thing was extending all across the site, as we were able to see. And it represents sort of a surface that could have been occupied and was buried by this sand on top. So here we are, we've removed the sand off of the top. This is in, gosh, I'm going to say maybe 2009 or 10, this year perhaps. And in the middle there, this little guy sitting there is my son Jonah, who's going to be a freshman at OSU this fall. So that's pretty nice to see him. Then you can see he's not getting much work done, just sitting there distracting people. But he always liked to excavate for about 20 minutes a summer, I would say. So he was a great worker for about half an hour. Anyway, you can see what it's like underneath these sun shelters. We had to make our own shade because it's way too hot there to excavate otherwise. The record I saw in terms of temperature was 114 in the shade one year. So the sun shelters made a big difference. But here you can see we're excavating in 1 by 1 meter squares, but they're all sort of adjacent to each other. In the deep hole in the bottom right-hand corner is our excavation unit from 1997. As we excavated, I told them to, at least at first, just take the gray sand off of the brown sediment. And then sometimes we would see unusual shapes like this depression that's on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you see Celeste Henriksen. She's an archaeologist, got her PhD at Berkeley, and she's helping me this summer, but that's a total station, a laser transit that we set up that helped us record every object we could find in the ground and measures where its northing, easting, and elevation is to the millimeter. And so that ends up being a tremendous data set for us to reconstruct what's happening here at the site. Okay, as we dug downward and removed the sand off the top, I noticed that there were areas that were sort of a more bright red, brick red, orangey kind of color. And if we enhance that with Photoshop, you can see it a little bit better, that orangey color. But it wasn't everywhere, it was only in certain parts, but in some areas it was kind of large. Sometimes we would excavate and see that the orange bit was a circle, and the students would say, well, as I'm troweling, it's like I'm making a different sound, the sediment's a little different, and they would refer to it as crunchy dirt. And so the crunchy dirt in cases like this often was this way because it had hundreds to thousands of little tiny pieces of fire-cracked rock or little pieces of debitage from probably resharpening tools. And so we found things like this that we interpret as the bottom portions of hearths. So if next time you're at the beach, and you probably have seen this in your lives also, any place there's been a campfire on something that has water and iron in it will turn to a low-grade oxidized, clay, brick kind of sediment. And so at the beach, you can scrape charcoal off the sand and see a circle of orange where the heat was. And that's often what we would see in this case. So here is a color enhanced version. This orange polygon is an area where I was seeing a lot of this orange sediment. And this is at the surface again of that brown sediment. So we decided, well, let's measure this. Like, what is this stuff exactly? We could see it with our eyes, but we wanted to know more about it. So we put these pin flags every 20 centimeters across the whole thing. And each of the flags had a number on it because we had measured each one in with the total station. And it took us all day to do that. And then we thought, okay, we'll come in the morning and we'll use this device in the upper left-hand corner, which is a handheld X-ray fluorescence device. You can point it at anything, pull the trigger, and it'll tell you what elements of the periodic table are in that material. How much iron, how much aluminum. It'll tell you if your ring is a cubic zirconia or not, things like that. So anyway, we came back the next morning and half of the tags were gone. And I could not figure out why that was until later we moved some of our sandbags and found that a mouse had made a nest with half of our tags in the night. So the rodents are the mortal enemy of the archaeologist for sure. So anyway, we measured all these things with the geochemistry of each of those squares, and this is what we came up with. So what we saw is that outside of this orange polygon on the left, this layer 6 sediment should be about 25,000 parts per million, or 2.5% iron. And then inside, you could see some extremely high areas of iron concentration. Now, the reason why we think this is happening is we think that there was a fire that probably burned the ground and it caused the chemical reaction to concentrate iron in that sediment. And here was the way that we measured it. Well, so moving forward, you can see at the top of this grid that shows, these are just elevations, and the contours are 1 centimeter, really small. So the area where there's this darker, sort of unusual cloud-like polygon at the north end of our top of our model here is where the iron concentration sediment was at. And it's in a slight depression also, as we note here. That is, green to light green is lower elevation. As you get up into the reds, it's higher elevation. But on the scale of pretty small amounts of centimeters, really. So it's pretty subtle, but we wanted to measure it. So we named this big orange patch a feature, and we just were curious, well, what else is happening? You see on the right-hand side, it says feature 1. That is that depression I showed you earlier. It's, I don't know, smaller than a meter, but it's a weird depression in the ground. So we decided to map, like, what are all the artifacts that were associated with the surface? So we have all kinds of tools that we give names to. bifaces and blades and cobble tools and grinding stones and things like this. And you can see they're kind of distributed. They're notably not that common inside that orange polygon. We also then looked at the debitage, that is flakes from the production of stone tools, and we see that there's some very, very high concentrations in some areas and not so high in other areas. So the darker blue it gets, the more debitage there was. And then this is fire-cracked rock density. So how many items per square meter? The highest peak where it gets really dark is about 31 pieces per square meter. Here's bone density again. And here's shell. So this is my interpretation of maybe what's happening. So we may have had activities going on the surface. Animal butchering and processing, there's a lot of bone and shell, and there appears to be a lot of river mussel cooking. That shell is from freshwater river mussel you can get in the river today. And on the left-hand side, there's what we think is a lithic workshop, and there's probably animal butchering and processing. There's a lot of flake tools, a lot of stone tools made of stone tool material, and a lot of animal bone. And then in the middle, we think there's a hearth in the middle, and there's burned soil. And so what I think happened is very likely, very likely this was a house and it burned. And so in fact, and I'll give you some more evidence of why I think that is, but that very large 2, 4, almost 6 meter long polygon, and we only see half of it. And I put the black dot line around, this is probably the size of it. If we could have excavated to the north, we may have seen it. But I think this is likely a house that someone had built. So wooden superstructure with matting or some other vegetative cover on it, you catch something like that on fire, it will burn extremely hot. And these have been recorded at multiple sites in the plateau interior Northwest region. We also found this nearby this feature, and this is an antler wedge. And so someone took an antler and beveled one end of it, and the end on you see the upper end of it to the right, is flared out a bit like a mushroom. And tools like this are commonly used for woodworking, and they're not uncommonly found in house features in the interior Northwest. And then what they would be used for is to take poles or even to take logs, and you can split out and make lumber from these things. You just simply use stone hammers and hit wooden and antler wedges in and start cracks and run cracks and start splitting boards. I once attended the culture conference put on by the Coquille Indian tribe in North Bend, and there was an exhibition where an elder and 2 young tribal members demonstrated. They took a really big cedar log and made them into a pile of planks in one day, and then the next day they built a house. And so they did it with just simply tools like this and stone hammers. And so it's a pretty amazing technique. Now let's look at why I think this could be a house also. This is a site from the lower Snake River called Weshpushnemay. And this was excavated by Washington State University. And in 1968 to 1970, Frank Leonardi ran this excavation. But you can see they're using large block style excavation. They're doing something a little different than what we were doing. That is, they're leaving every item they find in the ground, and they're pedestaling all the objects. And then you come back, map them in, make very elaborate drawings. We do the same concept and technique, but we just simply remove the items as we go, because leaving all the items in place like this until you've excavated every square down to the elevation is like the fast train to an ulcer. You know, it's like leaving this stuff out every night and then, and then worrying about it as a director. And, this is near a public road, and it's just too much. So I want to record everything as we go, and we can reconstruct all this with a computer later. So there's no need for us to leave it out when it gets exposed. Anyway, so here's a view of a house feature at Weshpushnemay, and you can see there's a lot of distribution of items, but also there's a very slight depression from the edges. You can see they've sort of traced it out. And in the stratigraphic profile here, you can see at the bottom right, there's a light colored sediment, but there's a line that angles down and cuts into that thing. And this is the semi-subterranean depression that was cut into the ground. So this is what a house actually looks like if you find it buried. Maybe it's not even exhibited at the surface, but you can see the lower depression contact here. There, I put a line on it just to help. In the house, they also found a couple posts in position still on the left, but notably, some of the houses at which Bushnell had burned timbers, and they were within the depression associated with all the objects together. So in the case at Cooper's Ferry, we probably had something very similar to this. We had what we thought maybe was a post hole, but you don't necessarily have to have post holes to have a house. Sometimes people make houses on top of the ground too, if they're not there very long. But you might ask, well, did you find lots and lots of charred beams like this? Well, we didn't. But this is also next to the river. And in our case, that is the Cooper's Ferry site's next to the river. And I think what may have happened is that the river came up, and that sand that's deposited on top of the brown is water lane sand. And it could have just simply pushed a lot of the charcoal away, floated it away, moved any logs, leaving behind heavier things like rocks, stone tools, for example, but leaving in the ground, because it didn't erode the surface apparently, leaving in the ground that orange stain from high heat oxidizing the sediment. Okay, let's move on to a lower part of the site, the bottom of this layer 6. And in this case, let me go back here. You see it's a pretty nice layer cake sequence. We have expectations that there should be the sand of layer 8 on top of the dark brown of layer 6. Underneath that should be more sand like layer 8, but it's called layer 5, and so on. And then as we excavate and go away from this 2 meter by 2 meter pit, I'm always paying attention to make sure that the stratigraphy, the layering, is consistent. Is it still showing it's the same record? Well, as we moved to the south, as we excavated away from the 2 meter by 2 meter pit in 1997, we saw that the stratigraphy started to break down. And so what you can see is on the right-hand side in the wall, there's the brown layer of layer 6, there's the gray sand of layer 5 and layer 4 and 3 underneath it. But as you go around to the left, you see that brown deposit of 6 seems like it's cutting into layer 5. And also there's some unusual vertical, almost looks like pipes that are in here. Now, these polka dots we see in the walls are from burrowing rodents. They're from gophers. And we call them Crotavina or rodent burrows. And in order to make sure that you don't get confused, you have to be able to know, are you excavating in sediment that's been pushed by a rodent or not? So as we excavate, when we begin a level, we see if there's traces of rodent burrows that you can see, and they just look like tunnels of different colored sediment. We would trace around them and tell the students, don't excavate those. Let's excavate around them and make them all stand up like sort of pedestals. And then we would photograph them, map them all in, and then excavate the interior of the burrows separately. So we recorded in place and excavated separately every single rodent burrow that we found at Cooper's Ferry, which was close to 4,000 of them. So, and that's the only way you can do this, and then be able to say with absurd statements like, we know which sediments are disturbed and not disturbed. So that's also why it took us 10 years to do some of this work. So anyway, so what does this mean? And this is all sort of messed up, but I have an interpretation of what this means based on some of the things that we were seeing before. So I think that we have our layers 6, 5, 4, and 3. But I think that there was a depression that cut down from the bottom of 6 into 5 and into 4. And what we see is that this depression got infilled by probably layer 6 type sediment. And there was an oxidized deposit that we'll talk a little bit about that I think might have been a hearth exposed in the wall. And this depression may have been used more than once. On the right-hand side, we might see these posts. You get a thing called a lateral berm, which is if you dig a depression, when you're digging it, you throw the dirt outside and you create a berm, or it's often sometimes referred to as the donut ring around a pit house depression. And that may be what this berm was here on the edges in the stratigraphy. To the north, just behind where I was taking the photograph, and I apologize, this photo was taken right after a big thunderstorm. So you can see there's some nasty looking parts of the wall that are all chewed up. And that's from water pouring off of tarps and cascading and eroding in just seconds. Like you work for years to keep the walls beautiful, and one thunderstorm can mess it up pretty badly. But we can still kind of see what's going on here. So you see that There's this unusual brown vertical thing here in front of us. There's also on the surface, there's some unusual round blobs on top. Well, let me annotate these for you. So these are features, as we call them. And again, features are just three-dimensional objects or arrangements you can't really pick up and take with you, like a fire hearth or a pit. That's what these are. And these pits are on the edge of outside of where we think that depression was. That may end up being a house. Now, feature 85, for example, that thing ended up being almost a meter long. And it basically looked like a dirt carrot or a dirt icicle or something. It was very unusual. And it tapered to a point at the bottom. These other ones, we excavated them. Feature 82, for example, was a really large hearth that contained very ashy sediment, lots of burned bone. It had lots of burned pieces of stone tool material. And the other pits were very similar in that way too. Okay, so having opened this up a little bit more, what I want to show you is our expectation at this elevation is that everything should look like this gray sand, but instead we still have brown sediment down deep. And I put a polygon around that kind of encloses where we were seeing that brown sediment. And there's our 1997 square. All right. Here's another one, another brown depression that's almost 2 meters across that was in the surface of this gray sand, but it was brown dirt. Now, that's important because we think, again, it's an intrusive thing. It dug into the ground below and got filled in with different sediment later on. Okay, so long story short, this is what I think is happening at this elevation. This shows us all the items that were contained within a 20 centimeter vertical distribution at the site. So we excavated all these, and it's too far away to see all the details necessarily, but every single one of these objects is an artifact that we measured in place. And the red ones, for example, are fire-cracked rock. And so you notice that this feature up on top that I said was a hearth is full of fire-cracked rock. And there's a hearth, or a pit, sorry, in the middle of this big depression that I think is a pit that may have been used for roasting things, perhaps, has fire-cracked rock in it. There's another one to the south that has a lot of fire-cracked rock around the edges. Also around the edges, you see we have some stone tools. So these are actually pieces of projectile points. And the text is actually obscuring it a little bit, but there's a soapstone item that we found associated with this thing that I think is a hearth that Dan Stuber and I have been working on that may be part of a dart thrower, an atlatl system. So what we also see is there are consistent radiocarbon dates, except for one in this. So we have a series of radiocarbon dates on charcoal and also on mussel shell. And they show us on top, we see that it dates, this thing dates between 10,200 almost to 9,800 calendar years ago. So if this thing is what I think it is, that it's actually a hearth, I mean a house with a lot of other ancillary pit aspects around it, it is the oldest house feature in the lower 48. In fact, it's the second oldest one in the Americas. But I'm presenting this as a very preliminary thing now. I haven't even published this yet, but I'm happy to share it with you. Don't tell anybody online. But this is how it goes. Science should be pretty open, I think, and this isn't something that is going to, get us published at the highest levels, maybe, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll do our best shot at it. But it's very exciting. The only other earlier house than this is in Alaska. It's called the Upward Sun House, and it is a little bit older. It's closer to 10,000 years in radiocarbon, I think. We have one early date down here toward the bottom, the left, that is near what I think is a hearth feature. And we also found a basally indented wind dust point associated with this hearth feature. And it's behind the black text, unfortunately, but we'll see it maybe again later. That one is unusual. That one doesn't match the others. And so there could be a reason for this. The tendency sometimes is to get excited and choose the oldest one. But we have multiple ages here, and I'll probably end up running more just so I can really overdo it and be totally confident. But, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the ages say it's between 10,200 and 9,800. One of them says it's in the 11,000 year range. Now, the reason for this, they both could be true. Both answers could be true. And the reason why is that some trees are really big and really old. So this is a photograph of a tree from mid-century, 20th century, came out of Washington State. And this tree, trees like this that were coming out of the Northwest during some of the original cutting of old growth trees were at a minimum 600, 800 years, but some of them were almost 1,400 years old. And so the middle part of the wood in this tree is 1,400 years older than the outer part of the tree. So if you get a radiocarbon date on the inner part of the tree, it's going to be very, very different than the bark. So that tree lived that long, and it dies, and basically from the inside out, in a sense. So radiocarbon wise, it's different in the ages. So this is called the old wood effect. And so you can get an old wood effect in areas where you have driftwood moving. That's very possible. Sometimes people will say, well, you didn't identify the tree, what charcoal that was. How do you know there's not an old wood effect? Well, identifying the tree isn't going to tell you if there's an old wood effect. The answer is you need to get a bunch of radiocarbon dates and then make sure they're all singing the same tune, I would argue. So, okay, so this is likely what I think this house could have looked like. And the reason why I really like this drawing, this was done by a geoarchaeologist named Roald Fixell, who worked he was a part of Washington State University. He worked at a lot of these very famous lower Snake River Canyon projects. But he drew this house from the Double House site. And the Double House site is about a quarter mile away from Cooper's Ferry. So it's just up the road. And it resembles the type that was built by the Nez Perce in historic times. And I think that's very telling also. Remember, we said in the beginning, the Nez Perce have oral history about this being an extremely long-lived village that have been repeatedly occupied for a very, very long time before the time of memory. And so what I really like about this too is the oval shape of it, and there are these different post arrangements too. And there are, I assume what this means by his drawing, there are pit features inside the house too. So, okay. So let's move on deeper into time. And we get down into the windblown glacial dust, and the world is very different, as we talked about in the beginning. So here's a shot in 2018, the last year that we worked at the site. And there's a lot of things I still have to do to report on the things we discovered and we observed. You can see in the upper part of this, there's a pole that's hanging horizontally, and there's a GoPro camera pointing down, and it's taking a photograph every 10 seconds. And we took photographs every 10 seconds for years as we excavated. And one of the projects we're going to do, I need to get a grad student to do this, I think, is have them put that movie together. And that will be tremendous to be able to show the site being excavated every 10 seconds. It'll be time lapse. She'll be able to run the movie of the excavation. It'll be awesome. And so I'm looking forward to presenting that. And this whole thing you see in front of you, we had to build this and then tear it down every summer. So that's what I mean about students helping. We made a fence around the outside. This whole pole structure was, something that was a lot of work to do. And we used to fill the whole thing with sandbags, 50-pound sandbags, about 10,000 plus. Every summer, we'd take them out and we'd put them back in. We had to make new ones every year too. Eventually, we moved away from that. We used these black crates. You can see where this orange pole is sticking in the ground. These crates really help to take up the space easier. Anyway, let's move on. So as we're excavating, this is a stratigraphy shot showing us the lower part. And we can see the iron-rich layer where we think the house was burned in this top. And layer 6, it's really quite robust. It's a really big area. But it's only sort of contained in that spot. As we go deeper, we get down into what we call layer 3, LU3. That stands for lithostratigraphic unit 3, but layer 3 is a little bit more friendly, I think. So anyway, there's a buried soil. So we say a rubified weak A horizon. You can see a bit of a darker color above this lighter color. And so there's a calcic B horizon. So this is a soil that developed under an environment that had pretty robust evaporation. So there were seasons when it would get wet, but then it would dry out pretty good. And it would leave behind this calcium carbonate in the ground. So the story we're going to talk about next is out of this layer 3. That's really where the earliest part of our site is located, right there. Okay, and again, here I am looking down at some of the work students were doing, where we're mapping every single thing we can find in place. This is the interior of a pit that had 50-pound to 100-pound blocks of andesite that someone had decided to test. They just simply took like one flake off of it to see inside, and they went, yep, this is good stuff. And they put them in a pit. Just probably caching these for maybe future use. Let's come back, we'll use it again next year. But in some cases, they just either forgot about it or didn't tell anybody or whatever, and we would find it, 10 to 13,000 years later. So, okay, so we wrote another paper in 2019, and this paper basically focused on the archaeology of this layer 3, this lower part that I was just talking about, the windblown glacial dust. And in this, we make kind of a bold claim using the terms late upper Paleolithic. And the reason why we're using these concepts is because everywhere else around the world, when we talk about Pleistocene age archaeology, you're talking about the Paleolithic. And in the Americas, because of the history of how archaeology developed, there was a tendency to use the term Paleo-Indian, which is fine, but that one usually, in my mind at least, in the mind of other people, is sort of reserved for the very unique things that develop in the Americas, like Clovis and Folsom and things like this. Well, we're trying to make a statement that the thing we're going to show you in this paper is extremely different than Clovis, but it overlaps in time with Clovis. And it's so different that we think we got to call it something else. And that's sort of what we do here. So 16,000 years ago, Dan Stuber, also OAS member, long time, he helped with this, he was on this paper too, and helped with the lithic analysis. And we couldn't have done it without his help and the help of a lot of other people, which is why there's so many names on this paper. That's the thing, you can't do archaeology in a complex way just by yourself. You really do need to have a good team. I emphasize with my students all the time, you have to be a really good human to succeed in archaeology. Like, you got to work with other people. I'm not saying that so much about me. I'm just saying that for the rest of you, you gotta be able to work well with other people, because it's a team sport for sure. Okay, so this is a bit of the punchline of what we saw in the very lower part in layer 3. Now we have on the right-hand side of our sort of colored diagram, we have layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 is sort of divided into 2 colors. The orange part is a part where the statistics of the radiocarbon ages is called Bayesian modeling. Now, I'm not going to go into how that works so much, but it's all about making a prediction about how old you think something will be based on all the other radiocarbon dates you saw before in a vertical sequence. And it said that the very lower part of layer 3 should start sometime between 16,500 and 15,200 years ago. And in this diagram, there's this black polygon with the 12,000 year ages. That is a hearth feature that we found in the loess. And it was, again, oxidized sediment. In this case, there was a lot of what looked like ashy sediments mixed in with burned ground and burned pieces of bone and a couple pieces of charcoal and some debitage and things like that. Then to the left, we had other pit features that were in the loess that began down and deep in it. This other one, PFA2, pit feature A2, it was the one I showed you in the beginning. And it's the one that was dug down from the surface, had all these points that are at the bottom. To the left, we also found these other 2 stemmed points. Essentially, what we found was that the radiocarbon dates in layer 3 go from about 13,000 years down to 15,600 years or so. And then the statistical modeling said it's likely to be closer to 16,000 at the very bottom. If you were to find those dates, the bet was it would be that much older. But we didn't have the bottom dated. Where we see the red dots are where we have radiocarbon ages. But we had artifacts down from the bottom too. So we thought, well, they're going to be older than 15.6 at least. So what we also see is the basis of 2 stemmed points at the top left. So more stemmed points that were found deeper in the profile than the ones we had found before. We also found tooth of an extinct horse in one of these shallow pit features that had a lot of stone tools in it. And this dates to about, I'd have to go back and look, sorry. It dates to about 14,500 calendar years ago. So, that was the only evidence that we could really say went with a horse. Now, we did find some larger pieces of bone, but they were so degraded, it was very hard for us to know what animal they would be from. And there are ways to try to figure this out that we may pursue moving forward. So these are the main tools that we found in this lower layer 6 that we reported in 2019. And we found these 2 bases of stem points and then a lot of other sort of cutting and scraping tools. So we presented this information in the paper, and it did make, I think, a pretty big splash at the time. But some critics were like, well, if people were really here 16,000 years, where's all the other projectile points and things like that? They always sort of want more and more all the time, the critics, but that's okay. So these are some reconstructions of how I think these stone tools may have looked. Now, of course, the dashed lines are just guesses, but these are pretty large stem point bases. So, anyway, the ones that are drawn are not from Cooper's Ferry, but the ones that are photographs are from Cooper's Ferry. The ones that are drawn are from sites that are 16,000 years and older in northern Japan. And so in this paper, we make an argument that the technology that the first peoples in the Americas had, at least in terms of projectile point technology, probably came over from Northeast Asia, from areas like northern Japan where people were practicing these ideas. Now, we pick out northern Japan specifically because you don't see people making artifacts like this 16,000 years and earlier anywhere else in Northeast Asia. So I should say the far eastern part of Asia, getting to the Pacific Rim of China, the Koreas, Japanese archipelago, is where you see sort of evidence that looks like this, but Japan has the best evidence that we've seen. Archaeology in Japan is tremendous. That's a totally different presentation that would be fun to talk about sometime, but there's over 1,000 sites that are 10,000 years and older in Japan. So public archaeology is really robust, and they do it in a really big way. It's really fascinating to learn about. Okay, they also make smaller stem points like we have drawn here, but 16,000 years and earlier. So all we're making the argument about here is that the ideas that people had in their heads as they were making these things in the Pleistocene in Idaho may have come from a social network that they shared with people in Northeast Asia. That maybe is where these ideas come from. It's not like people came over from Northeast Asia and got amnesia and forgot how to make stone tools and had to reinvent it all anew. That's not likely. So they had these ideas have to come from somewhere. All right. So then I haven't talked about Area B so much, but we're going to talk about that next. So we excavated that part as well as we were excavating down in Area A. So both sides got done, but we only finished the analysis of the other side a little bit later. And this last December, we published another paper in a journal called Science Advances, and Dan helped again. And we basically were able to show that we found more of the things the critics were asking for. That is, prove it again was one of the things they wanted to see, but also show us more form tools. Why you just find a bunch of flakes and some, flake tools? Where's all the points? That's really always what they want to say, what they want to see. So we were happy to oblige them, and we presented a new paper. So let's present. So this is Area A, where we were just talking about, where we had the deepest stuff here, sort of in the middle, you can see. And I'm going to skip over discussing this thing on the left. Area B, this is it on the right-hand side. This is the 12 by 12 meter excavation that went down. But what we found in Area B were in the lower layer of Lewis, we found the same stratigraphic units in the bottom. And in that one, we found 3 pit features. And in those 3 pit features, we found radiocarbon dates that average 15,785 years ago. And here's the plan view looking downward on the 3 pit features. And for scale, the one at the bottom, feature 78, is 1 meter across. So it's larger than a garbage can. And in the right-hand side, you can see, as we're excavating it, people will say, well, how do you really know when it's a pit feature? Well, because we see stuff like this. So you see the gray sand, and there's an internal deposit of mixed up sediment that has a different color because they're digging down through multiple layers and then putting the dirt back in, and it's getting mixed. So it looks a lot different. So feature 78 here is shown in this picture. Okay, well, the radiocarbon dates are from pieces of animal bone that were inside the pit features. And we worked with Oxford's radiocarbon unit, and they have some of the best procedures in the world for isolating specific amino acids that were used to radiocarbon date. So you know exactly what it is you're dating. So these are considered by most practitioners in archaeology like the best bone dates you can get in the world. There are other techniques that get a little fancier that some of my colleagues have said, how come you didn't use those other fancy techniques? And I thought, yeah, why didn't we use those? So I asked the Oxford people, what happened? How come we didn't use the super Cadillac version that these other people are talking about? And they said, because we didn't need to, because their samples were slightly contaminated. So we had to use the extra special one for them. But your bones that you dated here, your animal bones, were actually in pretty good shape. So we could date them a little easier. Right, that's the essential aspect of it. So in these layers, this is a diagram showing with depth on the left, pit features, and each of the orange triangles is a projectile point. Now there's hundreds of other items that we found in the pits, but I'm just sort of making it simple. And here you can see the radiocarbon dates on samples we found in these pits. So they definitely went together. Just to go back, outside of the pit features, there's very few items in the layer 3 loess. And so when we find items together like this, I think that's extremely, I mean, it's very much on purpose, right? It's intentional. That was the word I was thinking of. It's intentional. Okay, so 15,785, and this is what they look like. So an assortment of things on the theme of stemmed points. The one on the very far right is my favorite one, this little tiny green guy. That one fits on your thumbnail. It's that size. It's extremely small. And the blade has been resharpened at least once with pressure flaking. And the base, the stem, has been ground down to make it dull so that it won't cut whatever it was tied onto, likely. So I don't know if it was just something you made to show off you could make a small one, or it was made for a child, or it was maybe a very specific kind of technology. I'm not sure. But it was in with the others. And some of them are complete and some of them are broken. That's not unusual. But the fact that these are being put in the ground and some of them are still useful, you could put them back into service, I think is an important concept that we're going to explore more about. You know, is this just for storage? Or is this put in the ground for some ideological reason? I'm not sure yet. But essentially what we see from area A to area B is that underneath, you can see the sort of orangey brown deposit in the bottom. There's underneath a red dashed line. And that is a line that shows the surface was slightly eroded. But the point is, from side to side across the site, the ages make sense as we go. And radiocarbon dates in the very bottom get us to that part that the statistics guessed should be close to 16,000 years ago. And that was a very important thing to show. Okay. I'm going to just run through this kind of quickly just so we don't drag on too long. I'm not sure what time do you want me to stop? Keep going? Yeah. Are we okay? All right. All right. So one of my colleagues, David Madsen, he's an archaeologist. He used to be a state archaeologist for Utah, and he's done a lot of different archaeology projects all over the place, including a lot of work in East Asia and also in the Great Basin region. I've been great to work with him through the years, and we think a lot alike about trying to make sense of this early record. And again, we talk about this Paleolithic concept, and we're now beginning to try to push, and we're writing a paper that we're going to get published, I hope this year perhaps, that talks about this concept of what we call the American Upper Paleolithic. And why I say it this way is that there's now enough evidence from enough sites, I think, that we can begin to talk about a larger pattern of what might be going on. And this idea of a coastal migration theory. We'll talk about why all that goes together. Okay, so to zoom out from Cooper's Ferry, you can see it on the left-hand side. Here's the ice sheets during the last glacial period. South of the ice, there are some sites that are worth knowing. The very bottom one underneath the text box is the Galt and Friedkin sites. You may have heard of these sites. In fact, I think I saw you're getting Clark Warnicki is going to talk to your group this year, one of your speakers. Yeah, Clark Warnicki, he works at the Galt site. So you'll hear all about Galt, so I don't need to go into detail. But Galt is one of the most amazing sites I've ever been to in the world, in the Americas, for sure. And It's a really, really complicated, not complicated, has a lot of rich evidence of lithic technology that's really old and shows us a lot of examples of things that we don't see other places. Other sites include Cactus Hill and Meadowcroft, and these two sites have been in the literature for quite a while, but they sort of stood alone, and some critics have basically said, well, they don't really make sense. Why should we just assume that that has to be the early way the record will look? But as you start to see other examples other places, you begin to say, well, you know what, things are starting to make a little bit more sense together. Other sites worth mentioning, of course, are Paisley Caves, Schaefer, and Hebior. If you've never heard of these are two sites that have mammoth remains in farmers' fields that have some stone tools with them and that look like they were probably killed and butchered by people. And the Page Ladson site in the bottom right is in Florida. That one also has some mammoth remains, but some stone tools. These are ones that are earlier than 13,000 years ago, earlier than Clovis. The red ones don't have that many stone tools in them, which is why we kind of put them in a different category, but the yellow ones have lots of stone tools. Okay, here's the interior of Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. Very bottom, there's a hearth feature that dates to about 16,000 years old. So in this case, it's a concentration of charcoal and ashy sediment and burned objects. Cactus Hill in Virginia, there are a series of hearth features, again, like we were talking about at Cooper's Ferry, burned oxidized ground, they have burned objects with them, and a lot of stone tools, and they're layered, they're sort of buried in different layers of sand. And they date between about almost 17,000 years to 18,000 years ago. The Gault site has a Clovis layer in it. So again, you see on the right-hand side, the Clovis zone, they call it. And then the artifact frequency really dies down. But then lower than that, in the bottom right-hand side, you see all of a sudden small stemmed points start showing up. And these have age ranges that go from maybe around 20,000 years to about 12,000 years. Now, they use a different dating technique known as OSL, optically stimulated luminescence. That's why we call it OSL. Nobody wants to say that over and over. So, but OSL basically tells you when sand grains were last in the dark. When did sand grains get buried? And so the technique basically tells you how long has the sediment been buried. And so it's not as precise as radiocarbon dating, but there's no organic material at this site. It's leached because of water running through it. So they really didn't have another way to do it. Cooper's Ferry, we've talked a lot about that, but we have pit features. 11 dates from layer 3 range from 13,000 to 15,700 or so. Okay, we don't need to talk about that. All right, anyway, the point is all these sites sort of hang together between roughly 20,000 years ago to about 14,000 years ago. And we estimate based on these that the American Upper Paleolithic, which the archaeology contained in these sites represents, began maybe close to 18,000 years ago. Now, of course, critics are gonna, they love to do what they do. And I think we should always be critical about this work too. But it's just an idea and a concept, and I'll show in a minute why we think it all hangs together, not just the ages, but also just the artifacts alone. So if this all feels like there's something that should be there, not showing up. Anyway, based on these ages, we think that it may have begun about 18,000 years ago. Now, this is also consistent with paleogenetic evidence of the time in which people separate from Northeast Asia and come into the Americas. So paleogeneticists tell us that that time had to be sometime after around 20,000 years ago, people made a separation from other people in Northeast Asia. And the reason why they know this is the mutation rate of change, that is the genetic record of people in the Americas, is different enough from people in Northeast Asia that they could not have come into the Americas much more before 18 to 20,000 years ago. If they did, they would have a much stronger connection with the people in Northeast Asia, or the genome would look a lot different today. Okay, so assuming it took at least 1,000 years for people to spread across the continent, we think that the initial AUP occupation in North America began sometime between 19 and 20,000 years ago. All right, so characteristics of this, basically these early sites south of the ice sheets dating to 18 to 14,000 years ago have bifacial and unifacial tools. So they're making bifaces and they make a lot of unifacial tools, and they do it from these techniques where they basically use special kinds of cores. They also sometimes, and they make bifaces on flakes, but they also make them from larger bifaces. And they're making stemmed and lanceolate points. They're not making notch points. They're not making fluted points. So this is what this stuff looks like. So we get a lot of these prismatic cores, like on the right-hand side, with blades like this. This is from Galt. And then at Cooper's Ferry, we get other kinds of things that are called lavawa-like. And we don't need to go into the details, but it's just a technique for essentially striking a long, flat flake out of a spear, is sort of how you do it. These are very characteristic, we think, of potentially this time. The Cactus Hill and Meadow Crop, people are also making blades. So blades and long linear flakes are a bit of the theme, probably how you begin to make your technologies. We also see stemmed and lanceolate points being made at Galt, at Cactus Hill, at Friedkin, which is right next to Galt, and Meadowcroft. And also larger bifaces are being made at Galt as well. So this is what the American Upper Paleolithic assemblage at the Galt site in Texas looks like. So those very small projectile points are pretty crazy. I mean, that's really pretty amazing to think that before Clovis, people are making very small projectile points that are on the order of things that fit on your thumbnail. But we also already talked about this, that also these kinds of points are also being made potentially, well, they are being made at Cooper's Ferry also. So we think that at least the concept, now they don't have to look exactly the same to be part of the same design concept. That's important to know. Let's not read all of this, of course, together, but essentially paleogenetics of people in Northeast Asia show that in the last ice age, there's a merging between two populations. One is farther north in Siberia, and one is East Asian. And 75% of the genome of the peoples that will be later in the Americas come from East Asia. 25% of it comes from Siberia. And these two groups come together, and they basically give rise to a population that leaves and goes into the Americas. Now, we cannot know exactly where they came together, these two populations. But what we can do is look at the archaeological record to say, well, what else connects us? Not apart from genetics, what else connects us? And also, there's no gap between the ice to explain how people are getting down south of the ice sheets until after people are south of the ice. That is, the ice-free corridor opens thousands of years later, and we see people essentially south of the ice. So we think that that's why they may have come down the coast. So here's a diagram sort of saying what I just said. Essentially 75% of it coming from this part, the Pacific Rim region of Asia, and 25% roughly coming from above. And this is one possibility that they may have come together basically in the northern end of what's called, Paleosacchaline Hokkaido Kuril, PSHK. It's a series of islands that at low sea level, they come together. And they basically allow you to walk from what's now Russia down into Japan, or the other way around. You could walk from Japan to Russia on this linked series of islands, PSHK, Paleosacchaline Hokkaido Kuril. Anyway, we think that basically peoples that were living in this part may have moved up that area and met people from Siberia to the west of Ushki in the Kamchatka Peninsula, west of the Kamchatka Peninsula. An alternative is that this coming together may have happened at high latitudes in Beringia. But the problem with this idea is that there are not people in Beringia that we can see until about 14,200 years ago. So people are south of the ice sheets at Cooper's Ferry, at Paisley Caves, at Galt, Meadowcroft, Cactus Hill, Page Ladson, before they are in Alaska. Now that's an idea that I had never thought would be true when I was a student, because the oldest sites had always been, as I show here in the map, in the Nenana Valley and sites like Swan Point, which are 14,200. But the earliest coprolite at Paisley Caves is 14,200, and people were there before then. So at these other sites also too, we push us earlier than that. So there are no sites in Beringia that are at the same age as the sites south of the ice sheets. Now that's a pretty important statement, and we think that one explanation for this is that, well, people may not have come into Beringia until later. They may not have penetrated in until things got better. In fact, archaeologists in Russia and Alaska both point out that we really just can't find sites that that overlap with the last glacial period. Beringia may not have been a great place to live under the height of the last glacial period, which that's not hard to imagine. You know, when you have 1,000 sites that are older than Swan Point in Japan, it's like maybe Japan's a great place to live and Beringia is a terrible place to live. That's another conclusion. Okay, so where in Asia do we find similar assemblages that show the things that we're seeing in the American Upper Paleolithic? And as I mentioned, there's no evidence of large core and blade and bifacial points, the things I was showing you. They don't show up in Beringia before 14,200 years ago. In fact, there are no known lithic sites at all during the last glacial period. Again, that's what I had just sort of said. Okay, so what is leading up to the American Upper Paleolithic? Where could these ideas have come from? And I've already mentioned to you, Japan is where we're thinking this could be possible. So these drawings are from a site called Okashirataki. Okashirataki is in the Shirataki Valley of the northern part of Hokkaido. And there are 3 obsidian volcanoes nearby. And it's one of the richest sort of toolstone areas that I've ever seen. And people do amazing things with obsidian there. It's like this really creative lab in the Pleistocene for people to make stone tools. But as you see in the top, they're making stemmed projectile points between 21,000 and 19,000 years ago. And they're making them in a couple of different ways, large varieties and smaller ones, often made on flakes, like we see in the American Upper Paleolithic. They know how to make really big bifaces. They're comfortable with this. And they also can make what are called prismatic blades, so the blades at the bottom. They're really well versed in all these concepts that we traditionally associate with Paleo-Indians, but never really ever looks at this part of the world. So we think this is a logical cultural sort of ancestor to the American Upper Paleolithic. So this is a statement that we have been saying lately that winds people up. So until and unless earlier American Upper Paleolithic assemblages are found in Beringia, the coastal migration route of human entry into the Americas from human populations originating in the northwestern Pacific Rim region is the most viable and parsimonious, that is the simplest, most logical explanation for origins of the American Upper Paleolithic archaeology seen south of the continental ice sheets. Now, if human populations were present south of the North American ice sheets before 20,000 years ago, then their paleogenetic and techno-evolutionary history, that is, how they changed over time in terms of technology, must be different than what we're talking about here. So we're leaving the door open that there could have been perhaps other peoples coming in before what we're talking about. In South America, there are claims for sites 20 to 30 to 40,000 years ago, based on stone tools that look nothing like what we're talking about. Some people are not even really sure that they're stone tools or not made by people. In fact, there's been observations that stone tools are made by capuchin monkeys. Now, capuchin monkeys will go and find areas where there are nuts, and they will actually crack them with other rocks. They've been observed to do this. They'll get a rock anvil and a large rock, and they'll smash the nuts. And in the process, they will flake tools, in a sense. They're not trying to create a tool, but they flake stones, and they start to look like tools. And these have been found in sites in several places, and often these are just objects with 1 to 3 flakes taken off of them. And archaeologists have made the argument that that's what these are. Now, the other side of it could be that they're correct, that this actually represents people here before 20,000 years ago. But if so, they need to explain to us why then didn't these people contribute anything to the indigenous genetics of the Americas? They came into the Americas, made stone tools, but they all died out without leaving ancestors. And they also don't seem to know anything about how to make stone tools in a similar way to other peoples in the Americas and also Northeast Asia. So they're following totally different concepts for making stone tools. Why is that? Okay. All right, so let's wrap this up. So how have we increased our knowledge of early Pacific Northwest peoples? Well, we've extended the timing of archaeological evidence, scientifically validated, very strong evidence, in my opinion, the argument I'm making, that people were at Cooper's Ferry 16,000 years ago. And we've also affirmed our things we said before in 2019. We've shown important stone tool technological aspects that may be part of a larger social network in North America that we call the American Upper Paleolithic. We've demonstrated great time depth of traditional plateau lifeways in the lower Salmon River Canyon. In fact, the way that we think that these things that could be houses are being made 1,000 years ago. That pattern of how you might make a house is extremely consistent. So that is sites that have evidence of houses have features very, very similar to the things that we're talking about. But I have to do more work, I think, to nail this down. And also, we've given scientific detail about Nez Perce oral history and given perspectives into this time immemorial, the time before memory. So with that, I will end our long evening. Thank you.
Grab the mic so that we can. Awesome, thank you so much.
We'll do a little Q&A.
Okay. Also, I should say I have a lot of research partners to thank. And here's some of their logos.
The question is, I remember in an earlier part of your talk, you mentioned in Cooper Canyon that there was these fault zones about every 20 miles, and you had creeks going through them. Presumably, you have creeks going through there.
Yeah.
Have you have a program to look and check those other creeks to find if there's other archaeological sites along these sites? And,
Yeah.
Okay, and two, what kind of software are you using to make those isometric drawings, that the firecrack rock and all that?
Oh, the distributions of all the.
Distribution, yeah.
Okay. So the first question, have we looked in these other areas where there are major side canyons coming in?
I think you get this back for a little bit.
Okay. Have we looked in areas where there's other major side canyons? I have looked in some of these areas. Unfortunately, there's very few of them that are in public ownership. Most of them are private land in the canyon. And, some private landowners are not that excited about us doing work there. Now, admittedly, I could probably explore this a lot more. We have had success working with people getting access to land and looking at geology, for example, exposed on their land and things. And I think that, in the right kind of way, we could convince, people that this is something they might want to learn more about, and we could do it. To this point, I think that we've been really, really busy with this part, but I think that's an excellent natural way to move forward. That's something we should think about. And then the second question was, how do we make the drawings? So I take the data from the total station, that is the northing easting elevation data. I put it into a program called Excel, and then I make a XY plot, it's called. That is, I just plot the northing and the easting, and I get all these sort of rough symbols, and I can even color code them. I can give them different shapes. Sometimes if I want to make the graph look really nice, I just use that as a basis, and then I bring it into a drawing program called Illustrator, and then I just make my own symbols and float them over all the other ones. So it's rather labor intensive. There's probably a better way to do it. I'm stuck in a rut of certain skills. You learn them in grad school, and I don't want to let it go, I guess. So.
Double check if there's anything on the chat.
Okay.
I was just curious with the Missoula flood, why wouldn't they have washed out these areas?
Okay, I'll just speak loudly. Is that all right? Oh, we got another mic. Okay. Question is, Missoula floods, how come they didn't wash away all the evidence? Well, we are above the elevation of the flood pool. So we're far enough up the Columbia Basin. The Missoula floods didn't affect Cooper's Ferry. The lower 30 miles or so of the canyon, there is evidence of mega floods. And in fact, in that place, we have to dig about 2 to 3 meters down to find sites about 1,000 years old. So, because there's a tremendous amount of erosion and redeposition in that area. So I have no idea if there's any, I kind of doubt we're going to find it down there. And that also could be true of, because other archaeologists have asked me, they're like, well, if this is true, how come we haven't found it in the lower Snake River? How come we haven't found it in the, all these other rivers, Clearwater and so on? Well, it's because they're in the flood pool. So the Missoula floods either eroded and destroyed or buried it under, 100 plus feet of sediment. So it could be that they're there. There's very difficult to find. I should also mention that a road went through here in the 1930s at the Cooper's Ferry site and removed 5 meters of sediment. So when we start excavating, we begin at 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. But if they hadn't built a road, we would have had to have dug through 5 extra meters, which probably would have made this impossible. because the hole you'd have to dig, I mean, it's like setting up a mine then. And so there's a bit of that serendipity. And it also could explain why these are hard to find in other places, because they could be equally buried that deep. And so they're just not visible from the surface, or people don't want to dig that deep, or so on.
Were there any glyphs in the area?
Any rock art?
No.
Is that what you mean? Any rock art in the area? Not at Cooper's Ferry, not in the immediate vicinity. There's not that much rock art in the lower Salmon River Canyon compared to other places. So yeah, not really, unfortunately. It would have been wonderful to know. If we had found a rock panel down buried deep like that, that would have been neat.
Why haven't you dug further and seen if there's even evidence of older age deeper?
So we excavated to the very bottom of what we think of the archaeological deposits there. The gravel deposits below, we dug into them in some places, and there's no archaeology. And on the outside of the landform along the river's edge, you can see the gravel deposit sits on top of 35 million year old basalt. So in terms of the timing, I think it goes, to 16,000-ish in time, and then you get to these gravels that I'm not sure the age of them because there's nothing in it to date, and there's no artifacts in it, and then it stops pretty much after that. So, but that's a good point. It's like we're not saying that this has to be the earliest evidence, of course, of anyone in the Americas. In fact, we're making the argument that people could have been here earlier, but we can't evaluate that from Cooper's Ferry. You'd have to find another kind of site in a situation that had the dirt of the right age. You have to find an area that's holding on to sediments 21,000 years and younger, let's say, to evaluate that. So yeah, sometimes that just doesn't work out. There's not enough record.
Is there another one in here? Any questions? One who popped up.
Looks like only one question here in the chat. How would you propose
Okay.
to find evidence?
How do we propose to find evidence of the American Upper Paleolithic? Well, so that's a good question. Like, how do you know those bifaces that they're making are really, how do you know they really talk to each other, they shared knowledge? All right, now remember, here's another rule I should have added in there. Archaeology is argument. That's all it is, because we weren't there. We can't, say with 100% certainty it's exactly how it is. But we judge the quality of an argument based on how well it takes care of the facts. Like the known facts, which arguments sort of make the most sense with what we know. And all we can really say is a couple things, is that no one else is making bifaces in a similar way anywhere else other than the areas we talked about. That is the edge of the Pacific Rim, the Koreas, far eastern China into Japan, at this time period that's old enough to contribute the knowledge to the Americas. Now, people are making projectile weapons, they're just different. They're blades stuck in the sides of like antler and bone rods, or they're just long linear flat flakes, but that's not the same concepts. And so that's what we're trying to trace, is this cultural concept of taking a block of rock and turning it into that stem point. That's, Dan could tell you, hundreds of moves in the correct sequence that you have to do correctly to end up at that end product. You can't just take two rocks and knock them together and hope a stem point comes out. That's not how it works. So we're really looking for, where can we find basically the concept of how these points are being made? How can we see them in space as nodes of sort of where people are sharing this knowledge? So we are working in Japan. I was there last spring, and we visit museums and we make three-dimensional digital models of artifacts. And we're basically using that basis to do comparisons of how close the three-dimensional designs are to each other. Because we think that basically people figured out that what we all take for granted, that bifacial form of a blade, somebody had to invent that. And somebody invented it, I think, in our part of the world, in Northeast Asia, probably closer to the Pacific Rim. And as soon as they did, that may have been the thing that they needed to make this tremendous journey successfully into the Americas. It was the thing that allowed them to do it. I mean, why didn't, pre-human hominids that we see in Indonesia, why didn't they come to the Americas? Why don't Neanderthals spread all the way into the Americas? Maybe because they lacked the technology to do it, perhaps. So So maybe, but again, that's an argument. It's an argument. We'll see, but it's fun to build arguments.
I think we have one more here. One more in-person question.
Lauren, it seems really obvious that you bring a unique set of skills to Cooper's Ferry. With your background in geology and soils, and it seems critical to really unraveling and bringing full light to the importance of Cooper's Ferry. I wonder if you would just maybe like your background in geology and how that came to hurry up with archaeology.
Right. So yeah, geology and archaeology go together really well because, I mean, obviously making sense of the past from that which remains, a lot of it's sediment layers that look different and they have sort of different qualities. You can begin to ask basic questions about, well, where did this dirt come from? Why does it look different? How does it relate to the past in important ways? And also too, the art of archaeology is taking pieces of landscape apart in reverse order. You know, you start with the more modern stuff at the surface and you go backwards in time. So being able to be very comfortable with these concepts is something that anyone who's a student here in the audience or thinking about, even as a student, you know, a professional want to learn more, learning about geoarchaeology and learning basic things like, you know, concepts of how to read a stratigraphic profile. Those are pretty important things and they give you a lot more confidence when you're working in the field. I just sought it out because I did some projects where I went on a project in England after I was done with my undergraduate degree. It was a 450,000-year-old site in southern England called Boxgrove Paleolithic site, and it has evidence of Homo erectus people there making hand axes, butchering woolly rhinos and things like this. It's totally different than anything I'd ever worked on in Oregon, of course. But what impressed me is we were working in a gravel quarry, and we were about 10 meters below the surface of the quarry is where the site was. And all these layers were in the wall surrounding us all the time. And I would ask questions about what do these layers mean? And the students could all explain it to me. And I was just blown away that they understood this. And I realized that you're missing so much of the record if you cannot put these things into its place properly. And so at Oregon State University, I got a master's degree and I studied an interdisciplinary master's. I got a master's in anthropology, soil science, and geography. And then I went on to get my PhD, and I got a PhD in a dual program where I studied archaeology, and I also studied what's called quaternary geology. That's the geology of the last 2 million years. And so that's really the time period that's most relevant to archaeology for most of the planet, at least. And yes, you're correct. It's been very tremendous. And it's been a good opportunity for me to figure things out in ways that are harder for other people to understand. You know, other people do it differently, like Dennis Jenkins at Paisley. His geology isn't his thing. He doesn't really think about geology that much. So what he does instead is he's smart enough to know he has to get somebody to help him. And so that's usually how it goes. Like, I don't know anything really about plants. That's not my thing. You can only learn so much, only so much bandwidth and time you have. So I get someone to help me with plants or with stone tools. I've been learning a lot, but I get Dan to help me with stone tools. So I have a bunch of stone tools I need to understand. I got to get an expert. And a lot of times I'm just about there. I'm not close exactly where he's at, but you know, I'm learning. So yeah, being able to manage things, but also being able to understand that part has been very critical. And actually tomorrow I'm going to Idaho to work about a mile downstream from where we're at Cooper's Ferry, and we're going to work on the same landform, but in a different spot and see if there isn't more of this archaeological record extended that way. And so this is the beginning of another maybe productive phase. So we'll see what happens. So
Another 10 years.
yeah, who knows? Who knows?
I think it's just one last question right there.
There on the chat, it looks like somebody asked, how does Rimrock Draw tie into the findings?
Yeah, Rimrock Draw. So we've been hearing about Rimrock Draw in the news. You know, in 2015, there was a news announcement that Dr. Pat O'Grady, had made that they made a discovery of artifacts or a few artifacts below a layer of volcanic ash that I think might be 16,000 years or so. And then below that, more recently, they found, I guess, a camel tooth that they've dated very early on. And that's very exciting news to hear. But when you put your science skeptic hat on, you got to go, okay, well, you got to prove it. So, don't just tell me, show me. So show me what you have. And I see that you have a presentation coming from him. I'm actually come up and watch the presentation because I have a lot of questions. I'm not, don't believe me, it's not a hostile thing at all. I'm just curious. So I want to know what he has to tell us. And if he's right, and I think it's entirely possible that he could be correct, you got to leave your mind open enough. But you need to, let's seek to disprove it. Let's knock it down. If it stands alone on its own legs after you've asked all the hard questions, then it could be a real thing. So, but again, a lot of people, of course, are skeptical of any kind of claim early on, and we should also be responsibly that way too. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So,
Well, I think we all want to give you a round of applause.
thank you very much.
And this is for you as well.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to thank everybody for showing up. It was great to see a full house here tonight. I didn't see why.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And I hope you all have a great night tonight. And thank you to our volunteers, Kimberly, Penn McVeigh, Dave Root, Doug Rennell, and Roy Bryan as well for winning that award. And everybody for showing up. Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Sounds like a little.
I'm swaying.
It's really cool.
It's okay. Thanks for your trouble.